let's take a look at a somewhat more advanced example of the very same principle by drawing from Yuri Averbach's very famous book, Comprehensive Chess Endings. So in that book, he has the following position. This endgame is especially instructive because it allows us to show two very common techniques for converting this type of king and pawn endgame, where White's advantage lies in the fact that he has an extra pawn here on the queen side. So the first move that White plays here is king to f1. And following this principle that we've just discussed, which is that before trying to create a passed pawn to sort of leverage that pawn majority, before you do so, activation of the king is very important. Now the black king steps onto e7. Again, we notice that black doesn't really have an active plan other than to improve the placement of his king. So we do likewise. King d6. And now here White can push the pawn. He doesn't have to. He could also play the move king to d3. But the point is that after king to d5, the position would be disastrous for White if his king was even just a little bit worse, because White could not prevent the black king from coming to c4 and then hoovering up the pawns. However, as is, White can just go king to d3. And now black is out of ideas. He has improved the placement of his king as much as possible. He cannot make any further progress. And so he starts moving his kingside pawns. White simply matches this, pawn to f4. Black goes pawn to g6, and White again matches this, g3. Why? Because White is not concerned about breaking through on the king side. If he can simply equal what black is doing on the king side, then the decisive factor is going to be where his advantage lies. Black now pushes the pawn to a6, and White plays a4. Again, there's no need to take longer to create your passed pawn than necessary, right? No need to sort of go slowly for the sake of it. The only important factor is don't push your pawns too soon and allow the defending side to have a more active king than yours. The black king is now pushed back. White now advances, king to d4, and black plays king to d6. White now pushes the pawn to b5. Notice a little bit more of an advanced technique that is being used here by White is if we take a step back and we look at the following position here, then what we notice is that White has arranged his pawns in such a way as to control both the c5 and the e5 square. So that makes black's access onto the king side absolutely impossible, but it also forces black to step back even sooner, right? But not strictly necessary to do this, but it's a nice way of accelerating the win. White goes king to d4, black goes king to d6, and again b5. And we see that White is pushing a takes b5, a takes b5, pushing with this nice little touch, which is that the black king cannot go to c6. So the king must step back further. And here we get to this critical point. We have two very common ways of converting this position. Both are fine. I would say exercise caution with the second method, which is the Zugzwang method. We're going to show it in a second, but I'm going to show you first the simplest way to win. So the black king has had to move back to c7 in order to control the passed pawn on b5. White now changes gears, so to speak, and plays king to e5. He abandons his passed pawn in favor of hoovering up the kingside black pawns, while the black king is out of the action because he was busy capturing that crucial passed pawn. At this point, black can try to march towards the king side, but it's too late. King takes h7, king d4, king takes g6, king e4, and in fact, black doesn't even save that f5 pawn. King goes to g5, and the king must move anywhere, and king takes f5. But even if he could save that pawn, the position would be completely hopeless. So this is the safest way to win. And the reason why it's the safest way to win, will hopefully become evident very soon. White can play this move king to c5 instead, still guiding the b pawn. And he can play for Zugzwang, or even for stalemate or semi-stalemate, we might call it. Basically, the king steps to b7, white pushes the pawn, king goes to b8, white advances, king to c8, pushes the pawn again, king to b8, and now king to b6. So we have this position of a semi-stalemate. Why do I say this? Well, the black king cannot move. However, black of course has pawns here on the king side. So therefore, black is forced to advance his pawns, and now white can go pawn to h4. And now we see both the semi-stalemate method in play, which is what led black to have to advance his pawns, but we can also see this Zugzwang method. What I mean by this. Let's say black goes h5, now white goes king to c6, and the problem is that black must move the king. He would rather just pass, but he absolutely cannot. So king a7, king goes to c7. Of course, in this position, black could also advance the g-pawn. Then white simply captures the pawn, and we're back to square one, but with one pawn less. So this is a type of Zugzwang, a use of Zugzwang, which is, for those of you who are unclear on what Zugzwang is, it's when one side would rather pass, right? Because no matter what move they play, they have to play a move as per the rules of chess. And no matter what move they play, be it king a7 or be it pawn to g5, the move will worsen his position. So that is Zugzwang in a nutshell, and therefore this is one way to win. However, after pawn to h4, black can try and scare white with the move pawn to g5. Now, if you ever find yourself in this situation and you cannot calculate so well, you can always bail out with the move king to c6. And now, let's say he captures, and goes pawn to h5. Now you can simply drive the king forward, capture the f pawn, and then capture the h pawn, and it's an easy win. However, if you're feeling confident in your calculation abilities, you can make sure that you will be the one who promotes first and capture the pawn on g5. Pawn takes, f4. Now the problem is that if you were to play g takes f4, this would be disastrous for you because, as you can see, black is stalemated. He has gotten rid of his pawns and he has no legal king move. So instead of this, after h takes g5, f4, we simply play pawn to g6. F takes g3, g7, g2. And of course, this is what I meant when I said be very careful about using this method. I don't want to sort of get angry emails that there was some kind of miscounting and next thing you know, you actually lose this. If it were black to play, he would play pawn to g1 with check, and then soon your pawns on g7 and b7 would be gone and the result would be in black's favor. However, here, of course, it's white to play, so he promotes first, and with it, he gives checkmate. So those are the two most common and important methods to be aware of. The first one, guide the pawn, which if black manages to stop it, he will get himself into stalemate or semi-stalemate because it's not a real stalemate. And then you use that to your advantage. So in this position, you force black to move pawns, and sooner or later, he's going to run out of useful moves. He will have to just sacrifice a pawn. And once he sacrifices a pawn, then you just got to make sure that you're the one who promotes first. So that is one of the methods. And the safer method, which is the one we saw here in the beginning, king goes to c7 and just king to e5. Sacrifice your outside passed pawn for tempi. So you will be able to go f6, g7, and collect all of the pawns. In the beginning, we mentioned king activity, we mentioned passed pawns, we mentioned Zugzwang and opposition, and we've touched upon all of them to a greater or lesser extent. Let's now take a look at how a bad pawn structure can really hurt our chances to fight in the king and pawn endgames. Here, in this endgame, we see that white has a total of 7 pawns, and as does black. However, there is a key difference, and that is that black's pawn structure is not so good. He has these doubled pawns, and he ends up paying quite a heavy price because of this. So white here would proceed with king to f2. This should come as no surprise to us now that we know it's important to activate the king. Black would go king to e7. White would now go king to e3. Black would go king to e6. White would go king to e4 to defend the pawn. And now we see very, very soon the problem that occurs for black. You see, black has this majority on the queen side. He has these 4 pawns. But because his pawns are doubled, he cannot create a passed pawn using that majority. So for example, he can go pawn to c5. White would now play pawn to f4. And black can go pawn to g6 to prevent the advance of the pawn. White would now go pawn to g4. White could go pawn to h5. In this case, white actually has several options, but even if he played pawn to h3, takes, takes, now let's see the situation that has arisen. Well, a couple of pawns have been exchanged, but no matter, white still has this majority. And hopefully by now, it's become clear that black cannot prevent white from creating a passed pawn. He can perhaps play the move pawn to c6 in order to prevent access to the d5 square. After the move f5 check, pawn takes, the black king is pushed back to e7. And here we see something very nice by white. He simply plays the move pawn to c4. And what happens is that this extra pawn on the c-file, because it's a doubled pawn, it's actually quite useless. It cannot be used to create a passed pawn. So black can, for instance, play the move king to d7 and just wait around. But here white has a nice idea. He plays the move pawn to f6, by no means the only way to win. And with this move, he simply threatens to advance his king. Black can go king to e6, but white now plays king to f4. And we see that black will eventually end up in zugzwang. Why will that happen? Well, because white wants to bring his king to f5, and the only way that black can control that square is by staying on e6. But the problem for black is that sooner or later he will run out of pawn moves, and he will have to step back to d7. Whereas for white, he can initially respond with pawn moves, like for example, he can meet b5 with b3, as we will now see. But in addition to this, white could simply go to e4 and still be threatening f5, and then back to f4 and still be threatening f5, and just rinse and repeat until eventually black runs out of pawn moves and has to step back. So this is, again, not something to worry about too much, but it's nice to see this very good technique displayed by white. Black now pushes the pawn to b5, and white simply supports his c4 pawn. Black pushes a5, and now white locks up the situation on the queen side, very similar to what we saw on the king side earlier. Black now pushes the pawn to b4, and white now goes king to e4. So we see that black is now forced to go to d7, and white will now go king to f5. The black king is once again forced back. These squares are under white control. So let's say he goes king to e8, and now pawn to e6. Black may choose to capture. It doesn't really matter what he does at this point. King takes e6. And after king to f8, in this case white can go f7. King g7 is forced. King e7, and directly promote. It's worth noting that once again, the other method of going king to d6 and simply collecting all of the black pawns while black deals with the passed pawn would also lead to an easy win. So by now we have seen some of the most important fundamental elements of king and pawn endgames. We've talked about king activity throughout. You can see it here and in the previous positions we've examined. We've shown how passed pawns are often the deciding factor. And we've also discussed the very common concepts of using zugzwang, or the opposition, to your advantage. And finally, with this example, we have illustrated the problems of having a very bad pawn structure. So that is, I think, a very solid introduction at the endgame, some king and pawn endgames, some king and pawn basic concepts. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.